Find me the last quarterback to go number one, stay with the same team, and have success for 15 years. Peyton Manning. That's it.
It's almost disheartening to think about when guys that are as talented as you were and had so much potential to be a Hall of Famer at that level end up at a dysfunctional organization.
Welcome back to Unlikely Success. Like, comment, and if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe.
The Cleveland Browns selection is from the University of Kentucky, quarterback Tim Couch.
Tim Couch was once a name that resonated with college football greatness. Today, though, it's most associated with the words draft bust. How exactly did a college star, drafted first overall, end up with a career that left so many wondering? What if? Well, it could be that every Cleveland Browns QB becomes a what if, and not just the ones who were drafted there. It's pretty much all of them. But in Couch's case, he was the first in what is now a long lineage of failed Cleveland quarterbacks. He had been an absolute star at the University of Kentucky, where he was the centerpiece of the team's air raid offense. With Couch under center, the Wildcats were transformed into a high-scoring machine. They weren't competing for national championships, but they were doing things the university hadn't seen on a football field in a very long time. This included beating Alabama in an OT thriller in 1997. That was the first time they had beaten the Tide in 75 years. He also led them to 7 wins in 1998, which isn't exactly setting the college football world on fire, but in Kentucky, it kind of is. They hadn't done that in 13 years. So while he wasn't winning national championships, he was proving to be a talented leader who could turn around bleak situations, and a leader like that in Cleveland was desperately needed. One thing I found interesting is that Mike Leach was the offensive coordinator for Kentucky at the time. Leach was an offensive genius who would go on to perfect the air raid passing scheme, and the first exposure at the highest levels of college football that he had was his 2 years working with Couch. RIP to one of the greatest offensive minds that football has ever seen.
What do I know? I'm a football coach. I suggest you go out and do what I do. Get out of bed, go outside, then you know.
By the end of Couch's college career, he had broken NCAA and SEC records, including his 1998 season, where he threw for 4,275 passing yards, which stood as the SEC high mark for 2 decades. He was a consensus All-American, a Heisman finalist, and the face of a revitalized Kentucky program. Couch was sitting on top of the world. But life is about change, and that is exactly what the young signal caller faced heading into the NFL. In the 1999 draft, Tim Couch was selected first overall, the first ever draft pick of the newly reinstated Cleveland Browns. The team was returning to the league as an expansion franchise after a 3-year hiatus, but the NFL was gracious enough to let them keep their team history. So technically speaking, Tim Couch was not the first ever pick of the franchise. Whatever, I'm calling him the first one. Expectations and spirits were off the charts in Cleveland. It's a rabid fan base, and they weren't exactly treated well as the last organization left. Couch wasn't just a quarterback to them. He was seen as the savior of a city desperate for a return to football glory. But the task Couch faced was monumental. Unlike established NFL teams, the Browns had no foundation. Their roster was cobbled together from an expansion draft and free agent signings. The coaching staff was inexperienced, and the offensive line, a quarterback's best friend on the football field, was notoriously weak. It wasn't just a bad situation for a rookie to enter. I firmly believe it was the worst ever, at least up until this point. The head coach Chris Palmer lasted 2 years. He won 5 total games, and he never got a chance to lead another NFL team. There was exactly 1 Pro Bowl player on the roster during Couch's entire time leading the club, and they opened his rookie season by being blown out 43-0, a game in which they spared their franchise QB from being pummeled as he only came in the 4th quarter, when it was already 36-0. Cleveland would go on to give up 56 sacks, which was 3rd most in the league. They would have 1,002 rushing yards, which was last in the league. They lost every home game, and they started the year 0-7. Their first win would come from a flash of promise, as Couch would throw a Hail Mary that was tipped into the hands of Kevin Johnson. But hey, at this point, Cleveland fans could not be choosers. They were beggars. Sadly, this play would be the high watermark for the '99 Browns, as they finished with just one more win. Couch had a rookie year filled with disappointment, but he showed moments of potential when there was at least enough time to throw. Young quarterbacks who get hit early and often develop bad habits, and they start to lose confidence in themselves and their teammates. But Couch had 2 game-winning drives in the second half of his rookie season, and he finished by throwing over half his 15 touchdowns in the last 8 games he started that year. It might not have screamed Hall of Famer, but it did show some promise. The Cleveland Browns' instability during Couch's tenure cannot be overstated. Between 1999 and 2003, the team cycled a few offensive coordinators, a pair of head coaches, and roster overhauls. For a young quarterback, this lack of consistency is a recipe for disaster. Think of the consistency Tom Brady enjoyed in his career. This was the exact opposite. The coaching changes and injuries that Tim Couch would suffer led to the stunting of his development. He missed 9 games in 2000 with a broken thumb. The 2000 Cleveland Browns had the 3rd fewest points scored in a 16-game season, and a 3-13 record to show for their efforts.
Spikes in hell. Spikes in pee-wee hell.
But Couch led 2 of their victories, so I guess there's that. Look, I'm just trying to highlight some positives here, because the new Browns were just plain bad, and it was ruining a potential franchise QB. Couch appeared competent enough to win games. He had the athletic profile, came from a well-coached offense in college, but poor roster construction to this degree cannot be overcome. 2001 would start a turnaround for the Browns as Butch Davis came in and brought Bruce Arians with him as the offensive coordinator. It would lead to the best numbers in Couch's career, with 3,040 yards and 17 touchdowns, but he also had a career high 21 interceptions. Arians famously employs a no-risk-it, no-biscuit strategy though, so the uptick in interceptions is to be expected. These Browns were competitive for the first time in their new iteration and probably should have been 8-8 if it wasn't for whatever that was that happened in Jacksonville that year. Weird. The year was at least a step in the right direction. 2002 would be the second season under Arians and Davis for Couch, and he would play marginally better statistically, but the real difference for the team was that for the first time in its very short new history, they had a winning record. Couch threw for 2,842 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 18 picks, and for the first time in his career, he also had a winning record. Unfortunately, it ended with a broken leg. Man, this guy would have no luck if it wasn't for bad luck. What this meant was that he did not get the chance to start in the only playoff game that he would ever be a part of. It also opened the door for a QB controversy, as Kelly Holcomb came in and played extremely well in a narrow loss to the Steelers. Holcomb had just so happened to be the backup to Peyton Manning during Arians' time in Indy, and he was brought over as a viable backup to Couch. The problem is, Kelly happened to be too viable, as he would beat out Tim to take over as the starter in 2003 in what was a back-and-forth QB battle. Couch would play in 10 games, starting 8, but his time in Cleveland was coming to an end. The team regressed to 5-11. His numbers were worse across the board, and he was released prior to the 2004 season. By this time though, he had a rotator cuff injury that would sideline him for the next year, and he never really recovered from the shoulder injury. Bruce Arians has vouched for Tim Couch as a victim of injuries and circumstance, rather than a draft bust, saying the following: "Tim was no bust. It kills me when people call him a bust. His arm was just so torn up he couldn't play anymore. He would have been a real good one." And honestly, I tend to agree with Bruce's sentiments. There wasn't a quarterback in the league who would have been able to overcome what Cleveland put on the field in those first 3 seasons. Could they have won more games? Maybe. Probably. But nobody was leading the Cleveland Browns to Super Bowl contention from 1999 to 2001. It was an absolute disaster. One that ruined a young QB in the process. At least the job pays well, because Tim Couch's NFL career earnings were north of $20 million. So even if his professional dream became a complete nightmare, he at least obtained generational wealth. He can also lean back on the fact that there were 2 quarterbacks taken in the same draft who had much worse careers than Couch. So there's that. Again, people, I'm just looking for positives. What do you think? Would Tim Couch have been successful if he was taken second by the Eagles? Would McNabb have had a better run in Cleveland than Couch did? I think the Browns' offensive line would have been a problem for any QB in the NFL who was asked to helm that offense, not just rookies. But let me know what you think. This has been The Unlikely Success.
The number 1 draft pick as a quarterback is overrated.